After some recent announcements, Canada has received warnings about a massive loan that it's taking out, a loan that experts are warning could make bank stability worse. The same experts that say this instability should prompt the Bank of Canada to prepare to take action. Action that will impact every single Canadian, their finances, their job prospects, investments, and their mortgages. And it all has to do with a major update that's coming on Monday, the manipulation of some important economic numbers, mass money printing, and the risky reversal of that money printing, leading to cash shortages at Canada's big banks. So today we're going to get into all of this, and I'll explain the significance of this loan, the risks involved for the country, and for you personally for that matter, and the important details that we need to be looking at in the updates that are going to be coming in the next week or so. But first, we need to talk about what just happened so that we can then connect it to a much bigger picture. Take a look at this. You might have seen the recent announcement that the Bank of Canada just cut interest rates by another 0.5 percentage point after previously doing the same just a few months ago. And many are framing this as a positive, which it is in some ways. What Freeland is saying here is true. She says the Bank of Canada is cutting interest rates again, making Canada the first in the G7 to cut rates 5 times. It means your mortgages are going to cost less, businesses can invest more, and our economy can grow stronger for everybody. That's true. But on the other hand, there's a negative side to it as well. When the Bank of Canada cuts interest rates, it means that it sees weakness in the economy and has decided that it needs to act by lowering interest rates, which then props up all kinds of spending by making it cheaper to borrow, be it for businesses who maybe want to expand or in some cases just try to stay alive. It can also make it less expensive to borrow to buy a house or to buy a car, and it can additionally support all kinds of other consumer spending. So cheerleading and bragging about our economy needing support earlier and faster than other economies makes a little less sense, though framing it as purely a good thing as a current leader, well, that makes sense. Most people in Canada don't recognize the warning that decreasing rates actually gives us, especially when it comes in the form of multiple larger cuts, as we've seen recently from the Bank of Canada. Not everyone sees the negative here, though it's hard to tell if they actually don't see the negatives or if they're just pretending that they don't. You've probably already seen this clip floating around where the finance minister chalks up the financial feelings of Canadians, saying that those feelings are just a result of bad vibes.
There is a disconnect between the real economic the really positive economic news, the fact that the Canadian economy does appear set for a soft landing, that's good news. But Canadians aren't feeling it, and that is shaping their economic behavior in ways that are not great for the Canadian economy. People have been talking about a vibe session and how that is a challenge for the Canadian economy.
This so-called vibe session is something that I think the politicians are using to square the positive numbers that they're looking at, the GDP growth we're seeing, with the negative attitudes of Canadians economically. It seems that they're either confused or are just turning a blind eye to what's actually going on here. Like, how could it be that people don't feel our GDP growing? It must be that the vibes are off. People don't have a reason to feel bad economically. All the numbers that we're looking at, our GDP top numbers, well, those are looking good. So there must just be a disconnect between our strong economy and the numbers we're looking at and the misinformed public. At least this is the sentiment that the clip gives off. But there's a reason that people aren't feeling good in the economy, and it's not just vibes. If you've watched the channel before, you'll have heard me talk a lot about something called human stimulus. The idea of how our higher than expected economic returns of the past 2 years in Canada, well, that's largely been a result of the addition of more consumers into the system via the temporary foreign worker program and international student programs. By adding more people that need to buy things, there's more spending in total and more economic activity in total. And admittedly, that makes our top line broad numbers for the economy, like the overall GDP number, look way better than expected. But when you look at this on a per person basis, or in terms of how much does the average person contribute to the economy, and as a result, what are the average earnings of each person, well, on that scale, well, we've actually been in a rather prolonged recession. And this isn't something that was being widely said by government officials financials until just recently. Take a look back at May of 2023 when on this channel we first started talking about exactly this point, when it was risking any questioning of the immigration path that risked accusations of racism. This is right in line with the government's plans. They said that they wanted to add, on average, 500,000 new Canadians per year over the next 3 years. Now, on the surface level, this makes the government look good, right? Because with more people, you have more people working, more people buying things, and as a result, our GDP number grows, right? Our GDP number, which most politicians use as an indicator of our economic health, will grow. But what won't grow, or won't grow at as high of a rate, is the GDP per capita number that we've been talking about for the past 5 minutes. But now this reality has become obvious to everyone except for the people who were responsible for it in the first place, who still don't admit the true economic impact of these decisions. But people who are not far removed from their previous positions of power are more clear-eyed since their careers and reputations now aren't on the line. Here's the former Bank of Canada governor saying that we are in, and we have been in, a recession for a while now.
Even though we're repeatedly told we're not in a recession, are we in a technical recession, or have we had a soft landing? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, well, I would say we're in a recession. I wouldn't even call it a technical one. A technical one is a superficial definition that you have 2 quarters of negative growth in a row. And we haven't had that, okay? But the reason is because we've been swamped with new immigrants who buy the basics in life, and that boosts our consumption enough. It's almost like swimming naked while the tide's rising, okay? No one knows. But once the tide starts going out, then it's going to become clear pretty soon, okay? And that's what I think we're in a situation we're in. We have a lot of recession signals. The most important one that we've discussed in past sessions is that consumption per family has been steadily declining for nearly 2 years.
Now, these are all signs that the Canadian economy is weakening, and if we're to believe the new government policy that immigration is going to slow down dramatically, with the country experiencing zero population growth over the next few years, if we believe that, then where is our growth going to come from? This is a big contrast to how the US economy is currently doing, growing their economy both outright and also on a per-person basis, as we can see here, while Canada's is shrinking. This economic strength is going to be important to remember because it leads to a big problem for Canada. And in a moment, we'll talk about how, despite some serious warnings and the growing evidence of a weak Canadian economy, the Canadian government is signaling that it will be taking out a lot more debt than they previously admitted to. And this loan that the government is taking out on its citizens' behalf has some pretty major implications that connect to a warning that was given out by a global banking and monetary organization who sees some big risks on the horizon with some proposed solutions that, in my eyes, are actually just as questionable. We'll talk about all of that soon, but first I want to take a second to thank the sponsor of today's video, and that's Coinbase. It's likely that you've already heard of Coinbase. I mean, it makes sense. Coinbase is one of the most trusted and widely recognized names in the cryptocurrency world. Over the past years, they've been going through all of the regulatory requirements to make more and more fantastic features available for all Canadians. You probably already know that Coinbase is one of the best and most secure places to buy and sell crypto. They provide a platform that works for both beginners and advanced users, and they've got a super slick and intuitive user-friendly experience for those newcomers, while simultaneously giving you the option to toggle into this advanced section where they give you more features like lower fees and advanced charting, real-time order books, and the ability to define how you want your sell or buy orders to be executed. But what you might not know is that they offer a whole bunch of other services on top of just buying and selling. With their staking features, you can earn rewards from just holding eligible assets on the platform. And you can earn even more by taking advantage of Coinbase's Learning Rewards program that you can see here, which teaches you the ins and outs of different cryptocurrency and rewards you with small amounts of crypto after completing a short quiz about what you just learned. Millions of people around the world have chosen to trust Coinbase for all of their crypto needs. It's easy to use, it's secure, and as a publicly traded company, it provides more transparency than other exchanges do. And it also means that they're the most trusted choice for Canadians who want to explore the crypto space. So make sure to use the link in the description to sign up for a Coinbase account today. Coinbase Canada Incorporated is registered as a restricted dealer in all provinces and territories of Canada, and trading in crypto assets may result in the loss loss of invested capital. Thanks again to Coinbase for sponsoring today's video. So despite some serious warnings that we'll get into in a moment, our government is signaling that it will be taking on more debt than expected. And all of this is going to be outlined in the upcoming fall economic statement. Essentially, there's 2 times in the year where the government of Canada tells us, here's our financial plan, here's where we're going to be spending money, here's where we're not going to be spending money. The first is in the April budget release, and the second is in the fall economic statement, something that was a little late this year. It's coming out on this Monday, upcoming in December, as opposed to its typical day that it gets released in probably early November. In the budget that was released in April of 2024, Chrystia Freeland outlined a number of different promises, financial promises that wouldn't be broken. She calls them fiscal anchors, things that they can look at and say, as long as we don't break this promise, we can claim that our budget and our spending is fiscally sustainable. But now, with the signaling of what's going to be in the fall economic statement, it seems that some of those promises are going to be broken. Here's a clip of Freeland outlining those important fiscal anchors back in April of 2024, and then we'll follow it up with how things have changed.
We set 3 very specific fiscal guideposts. Maintaining the 2023-24 deficit at or below $40.1 billion. Lowering the debt to GDP ratio in 2024-25 and keeping it on a declining track thereafter. And keeping deficits below 1% of GDP in 2026-27 and future years.
One of those fiscal anchors she referenced in April was not passing that $40.1 billion upper limit of the amount of additional deficit spending that they would be doing. But now, Freeland makes no claim that they'll be staying under this cap. Instead, she now says, hey, kind of forget that target. What really matters is debt to GDP and the declining ratio of debt to GDP. Don't look behind the curtain at the other stuff. Look now only at this one anchor instead of the 3 I gave you before. Just a few days ago, she was asked whether or not the government would be spending more than this cap that they set for themselves. And instead of just saying, yes, well, we'll be spending more, and here's the reasons why, here's what we're doing with the money, instead she does what politicians would probably call staying on message, and instead just repeats the message that she instead wants to emphasize.
I was careful and precise in my comments about the debt to GDP ratio. Maintaining a declining debt to GDP ratio is our fiscal anchor. That is important. That is how we maintain sustainable public finances. When it comes to the deficit, Canada has the lowest debt to GDP ratio and the lowest deficit in the G7, and that's important too.
So as if the fiscal anchors from 8 months ago were never mentioned at all back then, she essentially says the only fiscal anchor now that actually matters is the one that we project will actually hit, which is debt to GDP. Pay no attention to the other ones. And a quick refresher about debt to GDP. It sounds a little complex, but it's actually not at all. It's basically the idea that it's okay for a government to take on more and more debt as long as the rate that they're growing that debt is growing at a lower rate than the total economy is. I.e., if we have more productivity and more economic activity in the country, and that is growing faster than our debt is, well, then it's okay to take on additional debt because we're growing our productivity and our economy faster than we're growing our debt. That's why they look at debt to GDP as a metric to say, hey, we're actually sustainable, or hey, maybe we're not so sustainable. The side effect of using debt to GDP as an anchor, though, is that it means that you have a way to justify increasing the amount of debt or the yearly size of the loan that the country is taking on. Now, as our economy grows faster than our debt, we look A-OK as per the debt to GDP ratio. But the problem with this is, of course, that these GDP numbers are manipulatable, as we saw with the human stimulus that was used to prop up these numbers, despite a shrinking economy when you look at it on a per person basis, something that I said in May of 2023, and now the former Bank of Canada governor is saying. So, in the coming year, GDP, or the country's economy, will likely grow more slowly than expected, or might even decline due to this reduced immigration, the immigration that was used to prop up the GDP numbers. And so this year, we can point at our GDP, which did grow, and we can look at it, regardless of what we did to get it to grow. We can look at it, and now when we're taking on more debt, our politicians can point to their sustainable fiscal track as measured by debt to GDP, even if that so-called sustainability was the result of adding millions of new consumers to prop up the GDP numbers at the cost of suppressing wages and decreasing the average person's income. This is what happens to the average person when people mess with our economy. But in doing this, to justify the taking on of more debt, we open ourselves up to some very big risks that were outlined in something called the Global Financial Stability Report. It's a report that's put together, I believe, twice a year by one of the biggest global banking and economic coordination organizations in the entire world. This is the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. As an aside, it's in these types of global organizations where personally I believe the true power in the world lies, a power that's above any individual central bank, any prime minister or president. But that's a video for another day. But for today, all you need to know is that the IMF, through this report, is essentially saying, here's all the things we need to look out for if we want our current debt-based global financial system to keep on ticking the way that we want it to. And it turns out that taking on more national debt, specifically in the current situation we find ourselves in, could be pretty problematic. Let's take a look. Talk about it here in the vulnerabilities and imbalances section, and it sounds a little complex, but I promise it's not. It's going to make a lot of sense. They say in many advanced economies, Canada, increasingly large shares of issuances of government debt will need to be absorbed by price-sensitive buyers amid ongoing quantitative tightening by their central banks, potentially increasing bond market volatility. Sounds complex. I think that they make it sound complex so that you don't look into it, but it's really simple to understand. And here's a quick reminder of how the government actually takes on debt, or how it actually gets a loan. The way it does it is that the government of Canada will sell a bunch of things that are kind of like IOUs. They're called Government of Canada bonds. The government of Canada will sell this to a bunch of different buyers. Essentially, the government is saying, hey, if you give me $100, well, then at the end of the term of this bond, maybe 3 years from now, 5 years from now, I'll give you back that $100, and I'll also give you some additional interest. As a result, a bunch of buyers will say, okay, well, Government of Canada, we will give you our money by buying these bonds because we're confident that at the end of these few years, you're going to give us that money back, and you're also going to give us an interest rate return on that money that we're lending you. And another interesting thing to note about these bonds is that as the price changes on those bonds, well, the amount of money you give them per bond, well, also the yield on those bonds, or the interest rate that they pay you, that changes also. As the price of a bond goes down, that means that there's less demand for that bond. People don't want to buy it as much. So as a result, the Government of Canada says, hey, well, we'll offer you a higher interest rate on your money to encourage you to buy these bonds. As the bond price goes down, the interest rate they give you goes up to essentially encourage more people to buy bonds. But things got really wonky during COVID because instead of this pool of all of a bunch of different buyers being the ones that would buy these bonds, instead it was the Bank of Canada that said, hey, you know what? We're going to buy up to $4 billion worth of government bonds from the Government of Canada using newly created money to do so. So instead of the Government of Canada needing to sell to these buyers who actually wanted a good return on this money, instead they knew that the Bank of Canada would buy up as many bonds essentially as they wanted to sell. Whatever dollar amount you want to sell, we're going to buy that up. We're buying like $4 billion a day. Now, in reality, there were a couple more steps here. The money first flowed through the Canadian big banks as an intermediary, but for all intents and purposes, it was the Bank of Canada directly buying bonds from the government. The benefit at the time of the Bank of Canada buying these bonds is that now the government of Canada can create way more bonds. They can sell way more bonds to take on way more debt because they knew that the Bank of Canada would quickly buy up any of the bonds that they issued, which would then push the prices of bonds up, which we now know would result in the interest rates on those bonds going down. But now, as of today, the Bank of Canada is no longer buying up all of these bonds. Instead, it's back to the way it was before, where real people and funds, people who care about the returns, they are the buyers of these government bonds. And if you go into more debt as a government by creating more bonds to sell, well, you risk reducing the demand for those bonds as you increase the supply of them, right? As you increase the supply, there's the same amount of demand. Well, that's going to result in the prices of bonds going down, which we also know will increase the interest rate on those bonds. Now, that's an issue for the Bank of Canada, or for the government of Canada, because it would result in an interest rate increase on Canada's government bonds, which would then impact the rates that average Canadians pay for interest rate sensitive things like mortgages. So now this quote makes a lot more sense. It means that in Canada and other countries around the world, more and more government debt isn't being bought by the central banks anymore. It needs to be absorbed by people who care about the returns they get, price-sensitive buyers, because no longer is the Bank of Canada purchasing these bonds through a program called quantitative easing. Instead, they're doing quantitative tightening, meaning, hey, we're not buying bonds anymore. If I lost you at any point in the past couple of minutes, all you really need to remember is that Canada doesn't have as much room to take on new debt as they used to during the pandemic. Now, if they were to do so, they would more heavily impact the economy because of the changing rates that they would have to offer on the bonds that they're issuing. And all of this ties into the debt to GDP anchor that Freeland has been pointing to, saying that as long as our economy grows faster than our debt, well, then we can increase our debt without any negative consequences. We're on a sustainable path. But even if our GDP numbers weren't able to be manipulated, as we've already discussed they are, well, it turns out that this debt to GDP indicator doesn't actually give the full picture. To help me explain, let's take a look at this report from the Parliamentary Budget Officer from just a couple of months ago. They project that our deficit for the year will be $46.8 billion in the hole. This is well above the $40.1 billion that Freeland previously promised back in April. This is what all the hubbub is about. It's far above this cap. But it does show evidence that there will be a decreasing debt to GDP. We see it stagnant for the next 2 years, but then decreasing all the way up until 2029, 2030. But a couple of things in this report make you wonder about just how arbitrary this debt to GDP number seems. First, take a look at this quote here. They say the PBO expects the federal debt to GDP ratio to be 42.2% this year and next year, and if nothing else changes, then the federal debt ratio will fall to 39% by 2030. But they do note that the pre-pandemic level of 31.2% of GDP, a debt to GDP ratio of 2019-2020, well, that is far surpassed even by our declined amount at the end of this decade. In short, yes, our debt to GDP is declining, but at the end of this decade, we still won't be back to where we started at the beginning of the pandemic. So then, what does it mean if we just jump 10% in an emergency? Nobody really even questions that jump, and then magically, as long as over the next years we start declining from that new high number, we're all of a sudden financially sustainable. Whereas if instead we had crept up to today's number from 2019, well, we'd have an increasing debt to GDP ratio, and by this logic, we'd say that our finances are clearly not sustainable. The second thing that makes you wonder about just how effective this debt to GDP metric is when you look at the US's debt to GDP, which actually is in a way worse spot than Canada, despite their economy that's doing better and doing better for the average person than our economy is doing in Canada, despite our better debt to GDP. Take a look at this map. It makes it pretty clear. Now, this data is from 2023, but it lists Canada's debt to GDP at 49.92. That's the debt as a percentage of the total GDP yearly, which is pretty high, but not high relative to America. We look south of the border, and they've got a 112% government debt relative to the GDP, meaning their government debt is over their average yearly GDP, their average economy. All of the economic activity in a single year doesn't make up enough to pay off the entirety of the US debt. But despite this fact that Canada has a better debt to GDP than the States does, the States is arguably in a preferable financial position as a country. Their economy is growing from actual productivity growth rather than just from population growth and these artificial number inflating metrics that we have here in Canada. But if you were following earlier, you might be saying, well, Russell, how can the US have such a high debt and debt to GDP? Didn't you just say that if Canada issues more debt, well, we'd risk flooding the bond market and risk impacting interest rates countrywide? Well, that might be true, but it seems that the US has issued way more debt as a percentage of their GDP. How come they haven't suffered from some major economic shock? Well, that's a good question, and the way I make sense of this is that the U.S.'s central bank, the Federal Reserve, well, they also printed hundreds of billions of dollars during the pandemic, more even than the Canadian government did, and that allowed the government to expand its debt, just as we did here in Canada. But additionally, I believe the U.S. benefits from having a far larger pool of people who want to buy up their debt, who want to buy their bonds. The U.S. is a major superpower. The U.S. dollar is the world standard for currency, and with the U.S. economy's strong growth of the past couple of years, maybe last year and a half, while other countries, as well as individuals and big funds, well, they have more certainty that the debts are going to be repaid when they purchase American government bonds, and that drives more demand, even in the face of more bond issuance as the government goes into further debt. Again, if I lost you at any point, all of this is just to say that using debt to GDP as a signpost for where you are as an economy doesn't really paint the full picture or tell you that you are truly financially sustainable. And to me, it just seems kind of arbitrary to use this specific number as a means of justifying taking on more debt. Now, I might be off base on this though, so let me know what you think. But as I said, the Bank of Canada is no longer buying these bonds. In fact, they're kind of doing the opposite, and it's creating a stressful situation in the financial system. If you watched the channel for a while, you might have seen this chart before. It basically shows how many Government of Canada bonds the Bank of Canada has purchased and at what rate, and how many do they still hold. And it tells the story of the pandemic. We saw it hit in 2020. The Bank of Canada said, hey, we need to prop up the economy and we need to do it in a big way. So they started money printing and doing QE, quantitative easing, which allowed them to, out of thin air, create money to purchase billions of dollars worth of Government of Canada bonds, peaking at about this is $440 billion worth of Government of Canada bonds that they purchased so that the government could go into that debt without negatively impacting the bond market. Then 2022 hit. Things change and the Bank of Canada says, hey, we're creating a lot of inflation here, or at least they're saying this behind closed doors. We can't be buying up all of this government debt anymore. We can't be stimulating the economy in this way. We've got to stop this money printing and this QE. So we enter a new phase, and it's called not QE, but QT. Instead of quantitative easing, it's called quantitative tightening. They make it sound complex, but it's not. It's just so that you don't look at it. Quantitative tightening, all this means is that, hey, those bonds that we purchased for a number of years, for 2 years, well, when they're due, when their term is over, we're not going to repurchase those bonds. We're just going to let them roll off of our balance sheet. This is what they say. They let them expire and they don't repurchase it. And as a result, the amount of bonds that they hold goes down over time as those bonds expire. But just because those bonds expire doesn't mean that the Government of Canada is off the hook. When those bonds expire, they've got to give back that initial $100 plus interest. But they don't have any extra money now to do so. So as a result, They just take on new debt to pay off the old debt. They issue more bonds and take out that new debt to pay back the people who bought the old bonds. This is how we have a growing debt year over year, year over year. We issue bonds and then we issue more bonds to pay back those previous bonds, and it just cycles like that. This is where things get interesting, because as this line decreases, all of the billions of dollars worth of bonds that are newly issued to pay off the previous debt that is coming due as this line decreases, well, all of that new debt needs to be purchased by someone, and it has to be purchased with cash. Cash that, unlike if you're a central bank like the Bank of Canada or the Federal Reserve, this cash can't be created out of thin air. It's cash that's already in the system. This is where we run into some major problems that we've been seeing over the past 6 months. Because it seems that with all of that cash piling into bonds, well, it seems that some banks are experiencing a cash shortage. Something that same International Monetary Fund Global Financial Stability Report, this is something that they warn about, because it turns out this isn't the first time we've seen a cash crunch because of this money printing. We saw this all the way back in 2018, 2019 as well, pre-pandemic. Here's the quote: "As quantitative tightening has proceeded in an orderly manner so far." Again, it sounds complex. I promise it's not. We're going to get into it. Here's the quote. They say that quantitative tightening has so far gone on in an orderly fashion. It's been fine. We've been careful with how much we're doing, and we're making sure that it doesn't cause any stress. Make sure that there's smooth functioning of the government bond and short-term funding markets. They're saying that central banks, like the Bank of Canada, have reduced their balance sheet. Remember that line going down that we were just looking at? Their balance sheet has shrunk as they've not repurchased these bonds. But the key tail risk remains is that quantitative tightening may drain bank reserves too much, and it could cause the type of squeeze in funding markets exemplified by the US repo market in 2019. It sounds complex, but it's not. They're saying that as central banks like the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve in the States, as they stop buying bonds with newly created money, well, all the existing money gets sucked up to purchase these bonds instead. And this can lead to a shortage of cash, or a cash crunch, referred to here as a draining of bank reserves. We saw a similar situation play out in the US just last year, even, when Silicon Valley Bank almost went under as a result of a cash shortage stemming from their bond holdings. That's a little bit simplified, and in reality, it had a lot to do with interest rate risk and the term of those bonds, but it's generally in the same ballpark of what we're talking about here. And this cash shortage has happened even before that, as I mentioned back in 2018, 2019. And there's also evidence that it's happening as we speak here in Canada, a cash crunch, though it's been rather under the radar. And this is really interesting because as of today, there's no evidence that we can actually print this much money and then unwind it safely without causing some sort of banking crisis. And to understand this, we go back to the first time we saw this money printing happening, the beginning of QE, where central banks would buy government bonds and buy other kinds of bonds as well in the case of the States. This all happened for the first time in North America during the Great Financial Crisis. Take a look at this. In the 2007-2008 financial crisis, well, that's the first time we saw the Federal Reserve print money to buy bonds in order to stimulate the economy, the beginning of quantitative easing, a new QE, if you will. Now, they had weakness in the economy all the way through till 2010. They continued printing. Well, by 2010, there was still weakness showing in the economy, maybe the hangover from the Great Financial Crisis. So they said, well, let's not ease our foot off the pedal of the money printing machine yet. Let's keep it going. And they continued to keep it going all the way until 2014. That's 6 years straight of money printing to prop up the economy from the US's Federal Reserve. By 2014, they were saying, okay, we've printed enough money, we've propped up the economy for long enough, but we're not fully ready to put our foot on the brakes like the Bank of Canada is doing now. What they did in 2014 was they said, well, we won't buy any additional bonds, we won't grow the amount of bonds that we hold, but when those bonds come due, we'll repurchase them. So we're not going to start sucking cash out of the system, we're just going to leave things as they are, and they did that for a few years until they decided the economy and the numbers they were seeing said it was appropriate to maybe start putting their foot on the brake, to no longer repurchase those bonds. That's 2017, the QT, or quantitative tightening, strikes back. This period is most similar to where we are today, with major central banks allowing these bonds to roll off their balance sheet, but allowing for this risk of there being cash drawn out of the system because, well, somebody has to buy those bonds unless governments reduce their debt, which hasn't happened in this period. So through 2017, 2019, quantitative tightening begins, but after 2 years of slowly letting the bond market absorb the debt that the central bank would no longer hold, as a result sucking cash out of the system, well, all of a sudden, in September 2019, this cash shortage came to a head when the U.S. overnight lending markets, they broke, and rates shot up 8% in just one day. QT strikes back. And the Federal Reserve themselves explains why this happened. They say as the result of the selling of Government of America bonds, Treasury bonds, that drained a large amount of cash. And as a result, the reserves in the banking system declined by about $120 billion over just 2 billion days. A big problem. They were like, oh shit, we need to stop draining cash from the system by executing QT. Things are getting messy. So they stopped letting those bonds roll off the balance sheet at the end of September 2019. So they have a big cash crunch crisis, but all of a sudden, not so long after, suddenly COVID happened, which gave them a reason to fire back up the money printer and begin QE again. Now, if you really wanted to put on that tinfoil hat, you could say, well, it was pretty convenient that just a few months after the US had a major debt issue as a result of QT, that a reason then popped up that necessitated them to go back to QE, go back to money printing, and to do that all over again. Now, personally, I'm not quite ready to make that leap or to even confront what it would mean if that were true. So to prop up the economy during the COVID pandemic, well, they, along with every other central bank, this time Canada joined in, we hadn't done this before, we started printing money. And we did so for 2 years, from 2020 until 2022, until this money printing created an unbearable amount of inflation for the general population. This is the return of QE. So to fight that inflation, they said, well, no longer can we prop up the economy, no longer can we endlessly stimulate it by printing money. Well, we've got to start QT again. We've got to unwind our positions. That's that declining slope we saw on that Bank of Canada chart earlier. Just like the Federal Reserve did in 2017 to 2019, way back over here, leading to the cash crunch crisis. Well, we're in a similar phase right now. We've got too much inflation. We got to unwind central bank balance sheets and suck cash out of the system. We got to get back to normal. The thing is, we don't really even know if this can be successfully unwound. Can you successfully undo the money printing that you've previously done? We saw a couple of years of them successfully doing that once they stopped in 2017, leading to 2019. But then they had that cash crunch issue that led to the Federal Reserve taking action and stopping their unwinding program. We've already seen some problems with this over the past year and a half. We saw it with the SVB, Silicon Valley Bank issues, as well as the crisis for Credit Suisse. These were all cash crunch crises. And in Canada, there's signs that the unwinding of this money printing, well, it's putting stress on the system. In previous videos, we've talked a lot about this, but from July to October of this year, the Bank of Canada made about $48 billion of extra cash available on a nightly basis via their reverse repo operations. Operations that I believe helped the banks stomach a similar sort of cash shortage where they were struggling to hit their cash reserve requirements that they're required to meet at the end of each business day. And it turns out that this kind of hidden operation is exactly what the IMF recommends that central banks do. They essentially say that banks like the Bank of Canada should be prepared to take emergency actions, and they should make sure that the banks are able to let them know when they need this kind of emergency support. Take a look at this. In the section of the report called Policy Recommendations, they say that central banks should be prepared to deal with financial instability, ensuring that financial institutions are prepared to access central bank liquidity by intervening early to address liquidity stress in the financial sector. Essentially, central banks be ready to help people in the event of a cash crunch. All banks should be required to test their access to these kinds of supports. Central banks should set up their frameworks for emergency liquidity assistance now so that we're ready when there is a crisis. And maybe we're already in one. Is this what's happening with these reverse repo operations at the Bank of Canada? It sure seems like it's related. But back to the end of this quote, they say, further progress on adopting and implementing frameworks for recovery and resolution is critical because we've got to make sure that we address the problems of weak or failing banks without undermining financial stability and also without risking public funds. That'd be nice to not risk public funds in the event of a banking crisis. That's a pretty valiant thing. Make sure that there's not going to be a bailout where governments need to step in and use public dollars to stabilize an important bank, essentially bailing out elite bankers using tax dollars. That's a good thing. But I'd argue that the tools for avoiding it can be just as damaging, even if it's more subtle and more behind the scenes. Because to avoid a cash crunch, a banking crisis, well, will we one day turn back on the QE money printer? Maybe we'll do so, and maybe we'll give it a different name so people don't notice, make it less obvious. Sure, that might save the banks without technically using public money, but it does devalue the dollar when you add more money into the system, and it increases inflation. And that's pretty much the same thing as using public money because you're funding the stability of the banks by making the dollars that citizens earn less valuable and by making those dollars buy less things per dollar. It's a sneaky wealth transfer, but unfortunately, most average citizens won't clue into it, so it makes sense for central banks to operate this way rather than having the governments bail out banks where people would be pretty pissed to see that happen. But back to today, it seems that the Canadian government will take on more debt than expected this year. That's what they're signaling. And they're going to confirm this in all likelihood when the fall economic statement comes out this upcoming Monday. And they're going to justify it by pointing at Canada's solid and declining debt to GDP ratio. But I wonder, and let me know what you think about this, is debt to GDP even a good indicator? We've swayed between having balanced budgets as an anchor versus debt to GDP as an anchor. Both different parties have used these different metrics at different times over the past 20 years. Like, it kind of seems like we're saying with debt to GDP that here's the analog for an average person. Well, I can keep on selling my house and getting a bigger one and getting a bigger mortgage every time I get a promotion. And I can convince myself that this is sustainable because I can cover the debt because of the increased amount of money I'm earning. Like, sure, that could work out, but it increases your risk. And what happens if you lose your job? What happens if the economy doesn't grow and we have a growing GDP or a growing debt to GDP? Like, does taking on more debt make sense right now when we can't guarantee our growth moving forward? I've said it once and I'll say it again. I'll say it a million times. It's a common thing. I think ultimately over the coming decades, what's going to happen is more debasement of the currency, more money printing as the response to financial crises of these economic elites' own making. So I don't think the system's really going to change. How can you set yourself up to be in the best position possible? I think the answer is to invest as much as possible. Invest in things like the S&P 500, broad indexes of all of the companies so that you're not concentrated in any single asset so that you could have a negative downside if something happens for that one asset, right? Have investments in a broad-based basket of things because honestly, that's what all of the elite have, and that's what they're incentivized to perpetuate, right? The people with the most power have the most incentive to keep the system going on as it is going on in perpetuity. Get yourself some low-fee index ETFs. Do so in a tax-advantaged account, I think, is your best bet. And as a backup plan, I do this. Have some money in alternative assets that could hold their value in the event of a U.S. stock sell-off. This could be crypto. Who knows how correlated that is with the existing financial market. That could go down as well in a worst-case scenario. Maybe something like gold. Maybe diversify into real property. It's hard to tell what the exact balance should be, but I think holding cash is a surefire way to lose over the long term. That's what I'm doing. It might not be right. It's not tailored financial advice for you, but just a place to start thinking about things. And I'm curious what you think about this whole video. We've been through a lot. What do you think of the value of debt to GDP? What do you think of us blowing by the 40.1 billion artificial cap, albeit that was placed on our spending in Canada? What do you think of this history of QE and quantitative tightening? Do you think we're on the verge of some sort of crisis as a result of the sucking out of cash of the system as a result of QT? We haven't successfully unwound money printing yet. Are we going to be able to do it this time, or is something on the horizon? I don't know for sure. I'm curious what you think. Let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already done so, subscribe to the channel. More videos like this coming in the future if you enjoy them. A simple subscribe is free. Doesn't sign you up for anything. It just helps out the channel. And sign up for the email newsletter where you can get all of the sources from this video and every single video going forwards. And with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.